sure a lot is going on in the world, and we'll be talking about that as well as talking to our special guest and all along those lines. So let me just tell you about some of the things that I was seeing in the world events, including some that are happening right here in the United States. A lot of people are preparing for the debate that will take place on Wednesday. So we do know that that is one thing that is going on in the world. And former President Trump has said that he will not be there. I think he's going to be speaking to some union workers or some people involved in that space and all along those lines. And one of the other candidates did qualify, so I think that they're up to 7. And the 8th one, his deadline is actually approaching fast. So it looks like at least 7 of the 8 that were there last time will be back at this one as well. And over in California, we do know a lot of things happen in California, and our guests will be coming in from California as well. Newsom has vetoed a bill on parental support of child's gender identity in a custody case. So that is something that is going on in that space. And apparently LGBTQ rights were bolstered in California with the new bill that was signed by Newsom. So that is something that we're seeing in the news, as well as Senator Bob Menendez facing growing calls from Democrats to resign after he was federally indicted and all in that space. So definitely that is something we are here seeing as the U.S. is urged to withhold military aid to Egypt in the wake of the Bob Menendez charges. So that is something else that is in the news as well. And for those that have been following that strike over there in California, it looks like that might be coming to a end as well, because apparently there are negotiations between Hollywood writers and the studios in the home stretch. And like I said on yesterday, because I talked to some friends of mine in that space in California, it looks like a tentative deal has been reached to end the Hollywood writers strike. So it looks like those folks might be heading back to work after almost a 5-month strike that was going on. And it looks like that might be coming to an end as well. And Louisiana is under a state of emergency due to possible saltwater intrusion in the water supply. So that is something else that we're seeing in the news as well. And definitely looks like Biden and Trump are deadlocked in a hypothetical rematch, according to some of the latest polls, even though there is one poll that had Trump running away with a double-digit lead over Biden, according to one of the polls that was out there as well. So definitely a lot of folks will be paying attention to what it looks like we are heading to a rematch in that space. And in New York City, they are tightening time limits for adult migrants to move out of shelters. So that is something else we are seeing. And some people are wondering if work permits will be fixing New York's migrant crisis as well. And I might get to our guest about some of that conversation as well, since his book is definitely dealing with a lot of things, including one of our histories of concentration camps, if we go back in time and all in that space. And definitely, it looks like folks are also tracking the tropics, because there is another storm that is brewing as well. So we already had Ophelia do some of its stuff, and now it looks like Tropical Storm Felipe is out there as well. So this is still hurricane season, and a lot of people are paying attention to that as well. And we do know that a massive storm soaked the East Coast, and a lot of folks were paying attention to that. I don't think we got it that bad here in Durham, North Carolina, but I do have friends in other parts, including my mom that was in Rocky Mount, that definitely got some severe wind and rain and all in that kind of way. So definitely it looks like folks are tracking the weather all over, because there's even a scattered showers and lower temps that we're hitting some of the Midwest as well. So definitely folks are paying attention to the weather as well, just like they're paying attention to the government shutdown, because some people are concerned about what that could do as well. So definitely McCarthy is confronting key decisions as Congress hurdles toward a government shutdown. And definitely a lot of folks will be paying attention to that and seeing what is going on in that space and all along those lines. And for those folks that were wondering about Jimmy Carter's health, well, he's made a rare public appearance. So at least he's out and about in the public and all in that space, because apparently the former president, Jimmy Carter, attended the Georgia Peanut Festival ahead of his 99th birthday. So Jimmy and Rosalind Carter made a rare public appearance in Georgia days before his birthday, and apparently 7 months after starting hospice. So he's definitely getting out and about. So that is a good sign, and all in that kind of way. And 3 were killed in sad news in a targeted daytime shooting in Atlanta. So 3 dead in a shootout over who got more money, according to what witnesses said, and all along that line. And of course, the community is calling for an end to violence after the deadly triple shooting in Southwest Atlanta. And the Supreme Court is hearing a civil rights case as well. So a lot of folks are paying attention to what the Supreme Court is doing as well. And guess what? It looks like hundreds of migrants are occupying El Paso's San Jacinto Plaza. So that is something else that we are seeing in the news and all along those lines, as dozens of migrants and refugees are arriving at the U.S.-Mexico border. And the immigration system apparently is under strain after the latest surge at the border. So we're seeing that. And there was another shooting, this time in South Carolina, where 3 teens were killed in a shooting in Richland County, South Carolina, according to the deputies, and all in that space. So we do see a number of things that are going on in that way. And if you wanted a lighthearted or more lighthearted story, this sounds like one almost out of the O.J. case, but it involved a golf cart. So apparently police were chasing a golf cart through San Bernardino Valley in a bizarre pursuit. So definitely it looks like a shirtless suspect were leading Los Angeles police on a bizarre slow speed chase in the golf cart with the dog in their lap. So they had the dog in the lap and they were running through in that area and all in that kind of way. And if you wanted a less lighthearted story, I can tell you about the Molotov cocktail that was thrown at the Cuban embassy in Washington in a terrorist attack, according to what the minister claimed, and all along those lines. And definitely that is some of what is going on in the United States. And let me just tell you a little bit about things going to the world, and it will bring in our guest as well. But Italian mafia boss Massanio Denario died of cancer months after he had been captured. So the notorious Sicilian mafia boss was captured after being 30 years on the lam, and now he is, died in the hospital and all along those lines. And apparently they're saying that China could do a lot to reduce the EU perception of risk, and EU warns China it will be more assertive on fair trade. So the Europe trade chief promises a more assertive approach to China as the deficit soars. And some metropolitan police over there in Britain have given up their guns after an officer was charged in Chris Kappa's death. So soldiers are going to help protect Britain from terror attacks as police hand in their guns. So that is something that's going on over there in London. And a lot of people are comparing those cases to what is going on in other parts of the world, including in the United States. And the Philippines has removed South China Sea's floating barrier, which was installed by China. So definitely that is some of the things that we're seeing on a global standpoint and all along those lines. And of course, the Canadian speaker apologized after a Ukrainian Nazi veteran was honored in Parliament. So there's outrage over Justin Trudeau's Nazi backing in Parliament as Nazi veterans got a standing ovation. So Canada is definitely under fire. They're under fire for that, and they're under fire for some of their role with the Indian assassination of the Sikh as well. So definitely there's a lot of things going on in the Canadian area, as well as Western intelligence has led to Canada accusing India of the Sikh activist assassination. So like I said, a lot of things are going on in the world and around the world, including the continuing war in Ukraine as well. But right now I'm going to bring a man that knows a lot of things about a lot of history and all in that space. I'm very glad to have John Suzuki with me, who has written a book about grit and all in that space. So glad to have you here with us. And if you'll share a little bit about your book. I've got to ask the one question, because I told Jacoby, who's with us here, that I was going to ask you this question, because, and I'm sure you get it asked all the time, but Suzuki is also a popular brand of a motorcycle and all in that line. So I just wanted to know if you were related to that particular family and all in that kind of way.
Hey, Mark. Great being here. Yeah, my first name is John. My last name is Suzuki. And Suzuki is the Smith of Japanese names. So my name is John Smith. And my middle name is James. So it's John James Suzuki. And my dad gave me that name because he was a World War II veteran, Japanese American. And he wanted to give me the most American name he could think of. It was John James. But anyway, yeah, no, I'm no relation to the famous Suzuki. But anyway, it's really super great to be here.
Glad to have you here. And I know you've written this book about American grit and so a lot along those lines. So I'd love to hear your story about what your family went through, because definitely it's a very touching story about how we treated those that were in the concentration camps and all along those lines. And
Yeah.
some people might
Yeah.
even make a parallel to what's going on with our Latin American migrants as well. But I'd love to hear your thoughts around
Yeah, yeah, no doubt. So when people think of the words American grit, they generally don't think of Americans of Japanese ancestry. But what I wrote about, I wrote this book, American Grit, because the concentration camps that happened during World War II are being forgotten, and in some cases they're being kind of swept under the rug. And these are concentration camps that happened right here in America
that.
when Americans of Japanese ancestry were 122,000 of them, including 50,000 American babies and children, were put into American concentration camps across this country for no other reason than their race. And this is something that people are forgetting and not being taught. And my concern, the reason I wrote it, two reasons, was because one, I want to make sure they don't do everything I can to make sure they don't happen again. And I'm seeing a lot of telltale signs of what happened back then happening right now. And I also wanted to bring attention to this one man named Shiro Kashino, who volunteered as an inmate of one of those concentration camps for the United States Army to fight and die for the United States Army as their families remained prisoners in those camps. And it went on to become one of the most decorated American heroes of all time. And so it's an amazing story. It's a story that I don't want to have forgotten. I wrote it so that the memory of those people and those victims continue. But it's just a wonderful story of courage and perseverance and history.
Yeah, you mentioned earlier, and I know it's something we talked about on this network before. It's part of the reason that the network was found is there are a lot of things that aren't covered by our media and by a number of other
Right,
institutions, including our educational institutions. So I was just wondering, how
right,
much of this are you afraid of? Because I mean, we're hearing about talks about cancel culture and a number of other things in that space. So I'm
right.
just wondering, how much are you concerned that our kids, whatever their descent is, are not learning enough of these various histories, including some of those that are the warts of our history as well? Because I but
Absolutely.
your thoughts.
That's the purpose of this book, is to shine a light on a really dark part of our history that we shouldn't cancel, we shouldn't brush under, we shouldn't whitewash, we shouldn't do any of that stuff. I mean, it ought to be out there, right? Because it's part of who we are. And history forgotten and history taught often gets repeated. And as you talk about our young people, and I spoke about some of the parallels that I'm seeing today, there are four things. Number one is fear. We are living in so much fear. You got us updated on the news, and the fear and the blame culture that we have right now, of blaming other people for the problems that we have. And we're also bucketizing people. This is what we did during World War II. We're bucketizing people. We have the white bucket, the black bucket, the Christian bucket, the Muslim buckets, the gay buckets, the straight. I mean, we're putting people into these buckets, and we're not recognizing them as individuals as much as I think we should. And so, and you combine that with poor leadership or poor leadership decisions, and all of a sudden you start seeing some of the makings of what happened back then potentially happening again.
Along those same lines and everything, I was just wondering, because one of the things that I know that me and Chitopi have talked about on this show and others is this whole notion of otherism and all in that space. So I'd love to hear your thoughts around that, because we do have a tendency, and you kind of alluded to it, to blame others when things happen in our culture. And there's another part, and I know you're of Japanese American descent, but there's another culture that was the Chinese culture that we saw blamed even during COVID and all along those lines. So I was just wondering your thoughts around some of the Asian attacks that have been going on. And I think that they're still going on, not just with the Chinese, but Japanese and others that are in that Asian culture. So as one that lives in California, I'm just wondering if you are seeing that and your thoughts around that.
I personally haven't been seeing it, but of course, there's lots and lots of reports of of that happening during COVID, as you mentioned. You know, you had the Chinese being attacked, or Asians being attacked, and it was crazy. You know, these people in America had nothing to do with bringing COVID to the United States, right? And but you know, even more closely, when people ask me, do you really think concentration camps can happen again? You know, you look back on 9/11. Somebody came up with a misguided idea that all Muslims are terrorists, and therefore we have to round them up and put them away. I mean, are you kidding me? You know, I'm really proud of the fact that one group that stood up against that was the Japanese American community and said, no, 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 that can't happen. And so reasonable voices, and of course, the president of the United States at the time had a transportation secretary named Norman Mineta, who was in a concentration camp when he was a child. And so he told his advisors, do not, whatever you do not give me a solution that puts people into camps like that guy right there was put into. And so, but you know, it's crazy. You know, fear brings out a lot of bad stuff in people.
No, definitely. And along those same lines, I was just wondering, how much would you say you can compare what the migrants have been going through out of Latin America to what you and the Japanese culture went through in the whole concentration camps? Because I do think that there are some parallels, and I do know that there were people that have been locked up in those kind of camps as well. But I'm just wondering if you saw some parallels there as well.
Yeah, there are definitely parallels. There are definitely parallels in how folks are treated. But one of the key differences is that what I'm talking about in our concentration camps was that we put away American citizens. You know, we put away our own people. When we were fighting in World War II for freedom and democracy around the world, we were locking up our own people in concentration camps for no other reason than their race. And so, you know, so there are parallels and there are differences for sure.
Yeah. I know you're also a leadership coach and a leadership advisor as well. So what are some of the things that you think you have learned from your experience in your family that you're able to bring into the leadership space as well? Because I do know, studying a little bit about you, that you're in that leadership space as well. So I'm just wondering, what are some of those lessons that your family taught you that you are able to bring into the leadership space?
You know, the big thing as it relates to this book is don't let it happen again, and let's learn from our mistakes. Right? Let's learn. You know, to me, the best leaders out there are leaders who surround themselves with people who are stronger and better than they are. Right? And you know, when we're talking about something like this, we got to get out in front of it. And you know, we're living in a world where, you know, especially in corporate America, we're dealing with diversity, right? You hear about inclusion and diversity all the time. And my concern is that you got this pendulum swing that's happening in this world of diversity. There was a time when Martin Luther King said, you know, don't judge a person by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. And my concern, as I talk about these buckets and the bucketizing of America, is that, you know, folks are being taught, and I was being taught, and you know, in the company that I was with, that we have to make judgments, and we have to decide on how we're going to treat people based on the color of their skin. When you see somebody who's Asian, or you see somebody who's Black, or you see somebody who's white, whoever you're looking at, you need to make snap decisions on how you're going to treat that person. And actually, I personally challenged it, and I said, you mean to tell me that, first of all, I'm a person of color, at least what I'm being told I am. And you need to make decisions on how you're going to treat me because of the color of my skin? And, you know, there was silence in the room. There's absolute silence in the room. And I told him, I said, because I don't want to be treated any differently than anybody else. And one of the other things that I tell people is, you know, I'm Asian, right? And Chinese, Japanese, Koreans, Vietnamese, everybody is lumped into this bucket, right? Do you realize that we all speak different languages? We all have different cultures, and there's not a single person in Vietnam, Japan, or China who identifies themselves as Asian, right? You go to Africa, and I don't know how many people identify themselves as Blacks. But I know Nigerians, I know South Africans, I know lots of people down there that identify themselves based on the country that they're from. And so, it's one of the things I'm trying to get out there is, think individually. And yes, there is a balance that we have to strike. And yes, there are disadvantaged folks, but be careful of that pendulum swing, right? Because the pendulum tends to go one way and the other, and sometimes we take it to an extreme. And in this case, in this part of the conversation of diversity, I just want people to understand that, because the concentration camps, that was a classic example of what happened when a prevalent belief at the time was, if they look like the enemy, they must be the enemy, right? So anybody who was 1/16 Japanese ancestry was thrown into a concentration camp, including children and babies. I mean, are you kidding me? Right? And so, I just don't want that to happen again.
No, there's a couple of things that you said that really interested me. One is that I know that a lot of times people are concerned about that monolithic attitude and everything, and thinking that all Asians are alike, or that all Latin Americans are alike. And as you just
Right.
stated, there are a lot of differentiations even within that entire continent, just like the entire continent of Africa and all along those lines. So I'm just wondering, how do you counter that even in the corporate environment? Because there is this notion that all people that are of Latin American descent are of the same, and we know that Honduras is not the same as Venezuela, and
Yeah.
same with Asia. Vietnam is not the same, as you just said, as Laos, or even the same as Thailand and everything. So how do you
Right.
break that in that corporate kind of environment, when a lot of people are afraid of that stereotype that you just talked about, that they are very much monolithic? And we know that no culture is totally monolithic, not even the African American culture.
Right. You mentioned the Latino Hispanic, right? The Latin American countries, right? Brazil speaks Portuguese. They don't speak Spanish, right? It's a prevalent language. And so, the way that I try to bring it out is by asking questions. Is just asking questions. And they're guided questions on purpose, right? But just getting folks to think. And I have this saying that I live for the aha moment, right? Where the light bulb goes off and you see the light bulb go off and they go, oh my gosh, yeah, you're right. Right. I mean, we can't, because I mean, look at identical twins. Okay. I mean, just to take it to, do you think identical twins are identical in every way? No. Right. I mean, I'm sure there are identical twins that are completely different from one another, and yet we will look at them, if we make these snap judgments based on what we see. What we see are two people who are identical, and that's all we see, right? You can't assume that they are identical in every way. They're not, right? And so too are these gigantic categorizations and buckets of people that we're creating. And so we just have to be careful. And one of the things that I try to teach people is, instead of getting yourself into the blame game and the victim game, learn to take responsibility for your life. Because I'll tell you, and this, the day you take responsibility for the decisions that you make is the most liberating day of your life, because now you are in control of it, right? You are in control of the decisions that you make. Your life is the sum of the decisions that you've made in your life. Now, a lot of people don't want to believe that.
Right.
People want to say, no, it's because this happened and that happened to me and this happened centuries ago. No, no. You can make changes. And just helping people take responsibility for themselves and their decisions goes a long, 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 long way. Yeah.
No doubt about that and everything. One of the things I was curious about is, you mentioned, I think it was one of your relatives that actually went to fight for the American side and all along those lines. I just wondering, what were some of the things that you learned from that experience as well? Because a lot of times people will be surprised that folks will go fight against their own countrymen because they are
Yeah.
definitely very much enjoying the values of America and all along those lines. And then on the flip side of that, I have seen people that have literally, in Vietnam comes to mind, gone and fought in other countries and found that the people were more similar to them in terms of their cultures and things of that nature, and they had a hard time in dealing with the killing of folks, and particularly when they weren't 100% behind the reasons for the war and all along those lines. So I think we saw that in Vietnam and a number of other wars. But I'd love to hear your thoughts around both of those.
Yeah, the Vietnam War was a little bit different than World War II. I mean, World War II, we were fighting. It was pretty clear what we were fighting for. Vietnam, it wasn't. It was there. You know, there's different politics behind that war. But you asked me about my dad. There were two main wars going on during World War II. One was in Europe, and that's what I wrote American Grit about. It's about the European theater and the guys that went over to fight Germany. But my dad, there was a lesser known group of men, and lesser known because it was top secret for decades after the war. But it was called the Military Intelligence Service, and these guys went to war against Japan. These are Japanese Americans that went to war against Japan as interpreters, negotiators, code breakers. And they fought against the Japanese with the American army. The very interesting thing about that was that in those days, the Japanese government considered everybody of Japanese heritage to be Japanese nationals. So if these guys were caught, these American men fighting against Japan were caught, they were executed as traitors to Japan. And it was another thing was that, to my knowledge, these guys were the only guys that required American bodyguards so that their own army wouldn't mistake them for the enemy and kill them. And so, and a lot of these guys also had a reason for fighting the way they did. And that was to prove their American loyalty, because a lot of these guys had their families stuck in concentration camps, right? Both the guys that went to Europe and the guys that went to fight against Japan. But yeah, it's really an interesting story of these guys who went to war, these Japanese American guys who went to war against Japan. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't it wasn't declassified until decades and decades after the war of who these guys were and what they did. But my dad was part of that.
Well, and I noticed that there were, and then I'm going to bring in Sasha Starr and some of the other panelists. Hopefully, you'll be ready to join us, as well as Nick Palveda and all along those lines. But I was just wondering, I did see these two ladies behind you and all in that kind of way. So I was just wondering if you could share a little bit about those stories, and one of them might be your mom or somebody else.
Yeah. Thank you. That one there is my mom, taken a long time ago. And so, she's gone. She passed away. And that one there, let's see, there, mm-hmm. that's me and my grandkids. And the picture on my right, that guy right there, his name is Shiro Kashino, and he's the man that I write about in my book. And he volunteered out of a camp. Went to war for a segregated Japanese American war unit called the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. And these guys were all Japanese Americans, and they went on to become the most decorated war unit in the history of the United States military, the entire military, for their size and duration. And one of the battles, just real quick, one of the incredible epic battles was towards the end of World War II, when the Fifth Army of 200,000 men were trying to break through the Apennine mountain range in Italy to get to Germany. And they couldn't break through for 6 months. The 442nd came in, and they did what the entire 5,000 men did what 200,000 men couldn't do. But they did it in 48 hours by climbing a 3,000-foot cliff that the Germans were not guarding, because nobody ever did it before. And they were ordered, if you fall, don't yell out, because you're gonna let the Germans know that we're here. And so 5,000 men climbed up a 3,000-foot cliff and surprised the Germans and took over the top of that mountain range within 48 hours. Wow, so yeah, crazy stuff.
Yeah, definitely an amazing story, and all along those lines. As I bring in Jatovia, and obviously I'll bring in Sasha as well, but I just wondered, what's one of the biggest stereotypes that exists that you wish that you could get rid of in terms of both either the Asian population in general and the Japanese population to be specific. Because I do know that a lot of times there are various stereotypes that exist, and I'm sure that you've encountered some of them. So I was just wondering, even in corporate America, what is some of the stereotypes that you work hard to counter and that you wish were not existing?
Some of the stereotypes, the biggest one is that we look alike, so we're all alike, right? I mean, we're and everybody is somehow, like I talked about the bucketizing stuff. But the stereotype, I don't know. To be honest with you, I don't know. They stereotypes come up. The COVID challenge that you talked about with the Chinese. Of course, everybody got caught up in that. All Asians got caught up in that. But the biggest stereotype is that somehow we're all alike, and it goes back to my thesis that we're all individuals, and we need to be viewed as such.
Yeah, definitely. I can see that. I know one stereotype that exists is that after the war, a lot of Japanese American companies were created, and there was a lot of success both in Japan and around the world with the business and everything. So just wondering your thoughts about that, and whether going through that war led to a resilience that might have made you all better business people, because definitely there is a notion that a lot in the Japanese culture, and I'm not saying all are, but there's a notion that y'all are very successful in business.
Yeah, it wasn't always like that, right? I mean, decades after World War II, it was hard for these folks. When the war was over, they were given $25 and a one-way ticket, and thank you very much, leave, and to start their lives all over again. And a lot of these guys lost their businesses, their homes, their farms. I mean, they lost everything, right? And they came home to society, who during the war they looked at them as the enemy. And after the war was over, they viewed them as the enemy that lost. And so in a lot of ways, it was worse. And so they fought through discrimination and racism for decades. But they fought through it. You speak about the Japanese, and this is what happened in the late 70s. And I did my master's thesis on Theory Z, which was all about Japan and their rise in corporate success. And but I'll tell you, before that happened, I remember seeing the first Honda Civic, or the first ones that hit. They were pieces of crap, right? and so Japan really worked hard to raise that quality. And you see the same thing out of Korea. You're starting to see the same thing happening in China in some ways. Initially viewed as junk, and you look at Korea rising from the ashes of the Korean War, and now just about every major appliance you come across is Korean, right? It's kind of crazy, but time does good things.
Yep, definitely. Jacoby, I've asked a couple of questions. I didn't know if you or Sasha had some thoughts, and definitely Mr. John can talk more about the book, but he's definitely explained a lot of it and all in that space. But definitely, Jacoby, if you've got any questions as well. You're on mute. There you go.
Oh yeah. I'll let Sasha take the lead on this one. I do have a few in the back, but yeah, I'll let Sasha start us off.
Yeah, hello, John. I would have this question. What you were talking before, it was mostly racial disposition of American versus Japanese, and it was distinct racial differences there, one way or another. However, what's going on now in war between Ukraine and Russia? You don't see the distinctive racial differences between Ukrainians and Russian. There are subtle differences because while Ukrainian is a pure Slavic nation, the Russians are a mix of Slavic and Asian extract nations. Also, they look mostly European, most of them, not all, but most. But different history, different experiences, mental, huge differences between both, create basically what Russians are doing now is a genocide of Ukrainians. They're systematically killing the civil population. They are ruining the infrastructure, and the world keeps quiet about it for some reasons. Everybody is scared of Russia and its nuclear arsenal, although nobody can confirm that it's in good working order, that it's possible to use. They never had any nuclear tests for the last 30 years. What kind of arsenal it might be if it never been tested in 30 years? But that's a different story. What do you think about the Zelensky speech in United Nations, where he was proposing the major reform of United Nations so it could become actually effective organization, very different from what it is now?
Wow, that's a big question. That's a big question. I do believe at a very, very high level that the United Nations could use some major reforming for sure. I've thought in a lot of ways the United Nations has been a broken organization for a long, long time. I am, despite what other people may think, I do support our support, the United States support of Ukraine, and helping them fight the Russians. I think the only and I don't know how everybody else thinks, but it's one of those things where I think one of the biggest upsets is managing how our money is being used, right? But I personally believe, and I've heard the stories about how Ukrainian children are being taken away, and that of itself is a sign of genocide, right?
Absolutely.
And so, so my personal feel. So I do believe Zelensky when or what he says, that the United Nations needs. I don't know what he means. I don't know the specifics of what he means.
There is one specific, I'll help you out. For example, now 5 members of the main body of, I forgot what's the name of it, that there have veto power, 5 countries. It's China, US, England, France, and Russia. For starters, Russia has no place there simply because there was a Soviet Union. When Soviet Union ceased to exist, there had to be a procedure to appoint somebody in the place of a Soviet Union. There might as well be Russia, but it could not be done automatically as it happened. So what he's proposing, Zelensky, to take a veto power from these countries to General Assembly. So if General Assembly, we say 2/3 of majority votes, decide to do a certain thing, that is decisive voting power. Not like it is now, one country takes veto,
Right.
Russia, and Russia even has no proper rights to this, yet it uses it all the time.
Right. I personally think that makes sense. There's a lot of things in the United Nations, like the human rights part of the United Nations, that I believe could be reformed. And so, yeah, I mean, I'm not an expert on the United Nations, but I certainly see things that I think could use some consideration.
So I will go even farther. Just a second. I will go even farther than Zelensky. I will propose that, remember that when Hitler started his war against Poland, England and France immediately declared the war on Germany. Now, slightly over 2 weeks later, exactly 17 days later, Soviet Union invaded Poland. How come that England and France didn't declare the war against the Soviet Union? at that moment when it was openly grabbed its part of Poland, according to the protocol. It's, they kept it secret for some time, but yet now anybody knows the protocol between Hitler and Soviet Union, how they would divide Europe. In that case, how Soviet Union ended up being part of a Nuremberg process to accuse Germans instead of being part of a Nuremberg process together with Germany. Because Soviet Union actually entered the war in an anti-Hitler coalition by an accident. They worked together with Hitler for a year and a half, almost 2 years, until Hitler attacked Soviet Union. So it was almost forced to become enemies of Hitler, not for the first almost 2 years.
Right.
Now they are precising in United Nations as the one of the winning countries of Second World War. It's a fluke. They were fighting with Germans to defeat the free world.
Right.
That's what they were doing. That's what they are up to. And it was Hitler's attack against them, turned them in all of a sudden Democrat fighters, which they were never were.
Hey, Sasha, just a quick question for John along similar lines. One that's a serious question, one that's a more lighthearted and all along those lines. And then Jacoby may have one as well. But we've talked on this show before about the threat of nuclear war and all in that space and everything. And I know that when we think about that, one of the countries that got impacted by that was definitely Japan and all along those lines, whether it was Hiroshima or Nagasaki. So I was just wondering, as a person of Japanese descent, your thoughts around the possibility of a nuclear war, even in this day and time and everything, particularly as one that is from a country that was impacted directly by that. So I'd love to hear your thoughts. That's the serious question. That I have one that's a little bit more lighthearted and everything.
Mark, I'm going to answer that question in a way you probably have never heard anybody answer that question. And let me just tell you a quick story. In 1973, I went to Japan for the first time, my first time, and I met my grandmother. And it was really, when we walked in, my sister and I walked into her house, she got down on her knees and she bowed to us. And my sister and I are just like, what's going on? We've never met my grandmother, and first thing she does before she says hello is she's on her knees bowing to us. And so we later learned from her that she bowed to us out of respect that we are Americans. And we said, why? And she says, as bad as we talked about Nagasaki and Hiroshima. And she says, as bad as those two bombs were, she says, those two bombs saved over 1 million people's lives in Japan, including hers. Because before those bombs were dropped, everybody was instructed to kill themselves when the United States invaded. My mom's family, was a samurai family, and so every one of the kids had a small sword, and they knew exactly what to do with it. But what happened was after the second bomb in Nagasaki was dropped, the emperor of Japan, Hirohito, immediately surrendered unconditionally after the second one was dropped. And so from my grandmother's perspective, if those two, as terrible as they were, and as many thousands of people were killed, from her view, over 1 million people were saved, including her. And she said, if not for those bombs, she wouldn't have survived World War II. And obviously I wouldn't be sitting here having this conversation with you. And so that was a perspective from somebody who was Japanese in Japan and lost people. She had relatives in Hiroshima. So that was a terrible, terrible thing. But the other thing, as an extension to that, as I look at it, is that we have those two experiences as historical experiences, and we can go there and we could see the terrible what happened. And so my hope is that because it happened, it won't happen again. But you just don't know. All it takes is one crazy guy with his finger on the wrong button. But that's my perspective of it, which is very different than most.
I would like to add something to it. As much as I agree with you that this is a horrible weapon of mass destruction, I would like to remind you, for example, when Allied forces bombarded, for example, Dresden in 1945, the total power of the bombs was no less than one that destructed Hiroshima.
Absolutely.
Not only that, I'll tell you what's now. Okay, for example, today's Russia, Putin, they were warned by several countries, including, by the way, China, India, not to use the nuclear weapons. So what they are doing instead, they are creating so much damage to infrastructure, killing people. So the effect is no less that it
That's
would
right.
be at
That's
least
right.
tactical nuclear weapons. No less, actually, it exceeds a lot. So I would say that somehow the borderline between nuclear weapons and non-nuclear weapons, it's disappearing, because if non-nuclear weapons can create much more destruction than nuclear weapons, so what's the difference? There is very little difference.
No, you're right. And Tokyo and the big cities in Japan were firebombed, right?
Absolutely.
And when they talk about firebombs, I mean, they're basically talking about napalm. And I mean, thousands upon thousands upon thousands of people. I mean, indiscriminately. They're just dropping these bombs, and same thing happened to England, and same thing everywhere. And so, yeah, you're right. You're right, Sasha. I mean, it's the people look at the nuclear problem and they see this great big the mushroom cloud happening. But so many more thousands and thousands of people have been killed with other weapons.
Toby, you had a question as well.
I mean, we've been very serious and deep on this.
Well, I'm gonna get unserious. Hold on, I'm gonna get unserious because he's also said he's a samurai.
Mark, I got you. I'll go lighthearted. And since we're talking about weapons of mass destruction, we're also talking about Japanese culture. Let's talk about the greatest kaiju ever, Godzilla. Now, I heard that in Japan, of course, they have the museums and everything else. But there is a brand new movie coming out based around actually the wars that we're talking about, Godzilla -1. Truthfully, how big is Godzilla in Japanese culture?
I don't know.
but John, along the same lines, but on a lighter note,
Yeah, no, that's totally awesome. That's totally awesome. Yeah, I think it's a big deal. It's been a big deal in Japan as much as it is here for a few decades, right? They call it Gojira. Yeah.
On another lighter note and everything, Japan is known for this amazing success, and I'd love to hear your thoughts about this. I don't know if you involved in this as well, because I think we just had a national championship recently, and oftentimes when there are spelling bees that go on, the winners of the spelling bees are awfully of the Asian cultures and all along those lines. So I just wondered if you had any thoughts around that, because when it comes to the spelling bees, every time I turn around, the young winners are awfully of Asian and sometimes Japanese culture. So any thoughts around the power of spelling in the Japanese culture?
Well, I'll tell you, there's power in ruthless parenting. Is what the issue is. I mean, in a lot of the Asian cultures, it is study. It is just, in my dad was American, with Japanese American, but he's still second generation Japanese. He still carried a lot of the Japanese culture with him. And my mom was first generation Japanese. And so, the whole, I think it's part of the culture that the parents expect you to really, really work hard. It didn't work on me. It didn't work. I mean, I was one of those guys in high school where people would see me walk through the door at the beginning of the semester and go, "Oh God, there goes the curve," right? Because I'm an Asian guy. At the end of the semester, they're like, "Hey, Suzuki, thanks for bringing down the curve, dude." So I was not one. I was not one of the smart Asians. But yeah, I think a part of it is that many Asians, especially first and second generation Asians, are ruthless in their expectations of their kids.
Speaking of ruthless, and this is where I really thought Jacoby was going to go and everything, share a little bit about the samurai culture and all along those lines, because you just mentioned that your mother was part of that culture and all along those lines, and it's definitely something that is seen in our culture quite a bit, including like with the Goliath and Godzilla and a number of other kind of movies that are out there. But if you just share as one that was born into that culture a little bit about it.
You know, in Western society, we romanticize the samurai, right? And we look at the samurai as being honorable and strong, and the swords are just crazy, and they cut, all that kind of stuff. And being from a samurai family comes with certain expectations in Japan, right? I mean, you got different parts of society in Japan, as you do in any culture. And this may offend some Japanese folks who might be listening, but there's a double-edged sword. There's a second side of that sword, right? And for me, I look a little bit. I'm a great student of World War II. And I think about how it's romanticized and the samurai are good and they're just and all that kind of stuff. But I also look at what they did in China, what the Japanese did in China, with the rape of Nanking. And I mean, these guys were, they were beyond brutal. They were criminal. And the stuff that they did during World War II to the vanquished, if you will, was just unbelievable. I mean, they had their own version. I've never said it like this, but Germany had the Holocaust. Japan did some pretty bad things too. And so, it kind of under the sword of, the samurai. It's like I said, different perspective, one that you might not have heard before. But
along those same lines, what about the perspective of the kamikaze? Because the kamikaze is also another part of Japanese culture that is
absolutely
as well.
Don't come home. Don't come home. Yeah, that was part of the whole. They call it's harakiri, but we call it harikari, right? It's honor. Don't come home. And by the way, we're not going to give you enough gas to get home anyway. So you might as well get out there and do something. But the whole culture of not losing face is very much alive and well in Japan. And that's the worst thing that you can do is to lose face. So the kamikazes were all about dying with honor, right? And not losing face for their families.
I guess we'll stay on the lighter note still, which is fun.
I love you, Jacoby. You're awesome.
So speaking of the samurai, I mean, that's huge, of course, in anime and film and video games. There was a beautiful game called Trek to Yomi, which was all about samurai. But one of my favorite movies, Mark, I don't know if you've seen this movie, called Ran by Akira Kurosawa. And it was about medieval Japan, and it was all about the samurai. Have you had a chance to check that movie out? Or did I make a good recommendation for you?
That's an old movie, right?
Yes.
Yeah, I know I've seen it. I can't remember what it was about, but I know I've seen it. Yeah.
It's a great film because it's the way it's set up. Mark, if you get a chance, check it out. But knock off about 3 to 4 hours in the day because that's how long it is. And it's set up basically in Shakespeare style. And you have basically the death of a father. And then you have the 3 brothers trying to figure out who's taking over for that father. It's a really great film. I'd recommend it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And when you look back and you learn about the Japanese culture and the history, for centuries, I mean, they were in civil war against each other, right? And that they had their share of brutality amongst themselves. But yeah, just like us,
Yeah.
they had and they have their own politics. They have to
They
deal
definitely have their
with.
own politics and
Yeah, back
everything.
then they dealt with it with swords. But anyway.
Because like I mentioned earlier, you're also a business leader and all in that space. So what is as we're getting ready to wind down and everything, what is the number one, because our economic show is coming up, thought that you would have or advice that you would have for somebody that wanted to get into the business leadership lanes? Because like I said, you've worked for a number of major companies. I did see that and read in your bio as well and everything. So what do you see as the key to success?
Key to success to me is, and people aren't going to like to hear this, but I say it all the time. Work hard. And, I have found in my life, the harder I work, the luckier I get. I don't know why, right? It just happens that way. And, when I talk to people and they say, hey, John, you know what? I'd like to know how to get promoted. I'd like to know, you got to be different. And I tell people, if you want to be promoted, start working at that level. Work at that level today. Well, wait a minute. If I work at that level, I should be paid at that level. Well, okay, you can look at it that way. But the fact of the matter is, the world grades you on a curve. Back in school, you were on a curve. And I don't care what anybody says. You are graded on a curve. You are graded against your peers. And if you have peers who are working harder than you, who are doing the things that that's going to help the company or whoever it is that you're working for, guess who's going to get the attention, right? So, stop with well, if I do that, they should pay me for it. Do it. If you want to get ahead, you have to stay ahead of the people that you're competing with. That's what you got to figure out. And that's what you have to internalize. That's how companies work. That's how you would work. That's how you do work, right? When you're thinking about hiring a plumber, you're going to look for the best plumber for the best price, right? Right? And you're going to be willing to pay the best plumber a little bit more because they're the best plumber. And so companies are the exact same way. And, people, that's that part of take responsibility for your life and go for it, because whatever you want. And here's the other thing, whatever you want in life is yours, right? It's 6 inches away. There's a guy named Jim Quick. He does all these YouTube videos about how to use your mind. He's amazing. He says, all of us are 6 inches away from whatever we want. These 6 inches, right? And I believe that. I believe that to the core of my bit. And for those who can't see what I'm saying, the 6 inches are the 6 inches between your ears. And right. So, I try to lead people, I try to really, really motivate them. And I try to inspire them. And, it's the carrot or the stick, right? I really like carrots a lot more.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And like I said, I know we're winding down, got the other shows coming on as well. But you mentioned earlier about diversity and inclusion. I think you've been involved in that space. But do you think that's something we should continue doing, is trying to diversify corporate America? Or is it something that is a kind of a hollow attempt and all in that kind of way? I'd love to hear
No, I absolutely believe in the idea of making people aware and being aware of that there are differences. And so I absolutely believe, I love the conversation of diversity and inclusion. I love it. What I don't love is the bucketizing of people and the categorization of people. And that's the part where I feel like the pendulum has swung in pretty far in one direction. But as in anything, pendulums have a tendency to come back, right? And so I think there's a balance that we haven't struck yet, that we will if we continue these conversations, which is the reason why I hope these conversations continue, right? But it's just the bucketizing part of it that I hope we examine a little bit more.
No, that makes a lot of sense. As we get ready to wind down, if you would just share with people once again about your book and how they can get a copy of that book, and hopefully you'll make a return trip. I know that we've not had enough of the representation in terms of representation from the Asian population. We definitely have some couple of shows that are Latin, but we've not had enough representation even here on the network in the Asian population. So I do hope that you will make a return trip.
I would be honored. I would be honored. If anybody wants to get more information, I'm at johnsuzuki.com, just like the motorcycle, johnsuzuki.com. And they can get my book on Amazon. It's an Amazon bestseller. It's called American Grit. And so I'd be on. And if you do pick up the book and you do read the book, one thing I ask is don't stick it up on your bookshelf like I do with these guys. Give it to somebody. Give it away so they don't have to buy it and they have an opportunity to learn from it. But thank you. I'd love to come back.
Sounds good. We'll definitely have to get you to come back. And all along those lines, like I said, we're going to have our economic show, but I have thoroughly enjoyed the conversation. I hope you've enjoyed it as well. And we're going to get off. We got economics and Media Monday and then some other shows, including Dr. Anthony talking about education at 6 this evening and all along those lines. But we're going to get on out of here. And I've greatly appreciated having John Suzuki come on and talk about his book, American Grit. So definitely look forward to having him make a return trip.
Thank you, Mark. Look forward to it.
Yeah.